And welcome back, class, to the true and accurate history of Mongolia, Part 11, The Whole World in His Hands. When we left off, Genghis Khan had deployed the first nuclear weapon in history against Vienna, in a show of force meant to terrify the Incan nations, and to show the people of Vienna that he was not interested in taking prisoners. The assault on the city-state continued, even as the Inca, in desperation, attempted to expand to some unused land in the southern continent in a desperate attempt to salvage their empire in the face of what seemed like unavoidable destruction. The year is 1989. It's nearing the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. There we see the final shelling of Vienna, merciless assaults. The mechanized infantry marches right in, and Vienna falls to Genghis Khan, leaving only the remnants of the Incan Empire across the south of the New World and the southeast of the southern continent. Now, Genghis Khan's cultural initiatives had been going well in the old world, and it led to the dawning of a new golden age in the 90s. An age of prosperity, an age of joy, an age of supreme expansion of the mind and of the thoughts of the people of the Mongolian Empire, which now spread across nearly the entire world. New technologies were being discovered at an amazing rate. New weapons, but along with the weapons came non-violent applications of technology. For one of the first times in Mongol history, advancements were being allowed and even encouraged in areas outside of the realm of violence. It was no wonder that a golden age had dawned once again. You can see here the troops massed along the uneasy line of truce with the Incans. The 90s were a time of tense, very tense political, diplomatic maneuvers between the two nations. Genghis Khan attempted to secure the Incan Empire's peaceful surrender, but Pachacuti was a proud man. You can see Cristo Redentor, the largest statue in the world, was completed in 1996 in the Mongol Empire. Some people attributed it a religious significance, but as the Mongol Empire had no official religion, the question of which figure it represented was one long left unanswered. So Pachacuti was refusing to surrender to the Mongols. It was also at this time that in order to control the sprawling empire he had created, Genghis Khan, with the help of his advisors, his khans, and the political advisors he had built up, developed a new system of rule which they put into place called communism. The idea behind it was of equality, and that people would each contribute according to his or her abilities, and that would lead to an egalitarian society, one which was also uniform and more easy to control. The success of the system was almost immediately apparent, but the problem of the Incas still remained as they moved into the 21st century. The future was here, but the people of Pachacuti's domain yet refused to admit that the Mongols were their superior not only militarily, but culturally, and in terms of how wonderful Genghis Khan was, which, in his old age, having softened over the years, was quite wonderful. And as they refused to accept that and surrender, war broke out, first here in the southern continent, with missile attacks against the Incan forces. The mechanized infantry moved in, made short work of the defenders of Nazca, the central city on the southern continent. The workers were captured, and two cities were cut off from each other, and missile strikes destroyed what was left of their soldiers. It was war once again. Missile strikes against Nazca, the first time these missiles had been used widely. In the New World, war broke out again. Naval bombardments, as Genghis Khan preferred, served as a precursor to the ground mobilization of the rocket infantry, the mechanized infantry, and the tanks rolling south across the border, destroying the defenders and moving in against the remaining cities of the Incan Empire. Genghis Khan, Burqa Khan, and Manka Temür Khan oversaw the battle at different points across the border. It was a violent time, but it was something that the Mongol Empire had declared to be necessary. There was no need for a competing civilization to exist in the world, not when the Mongol Empire had already proved itself to be the strongest, the ablest, the most culturally advanced, and the most politically progressive nation in existence. Pachacuti had no chance, and yet they held out, attempting to expand and fight back through population growth and proliferation of their people and culture throughout different parts of the world. But it was always a question of whose army would win out first. The United Nations, ironically, constructed in 2006. Genghis Khan declared that all nations conquered by the Mongols were thus united. Thus the United Nations was the name of the governing body of the Mongol Empire. It was a bit of a admission to the fact that the Mongol Empire had not grown on its own. It had assimilated other cultures, other civilizations, and grown using the cultures that they had taken over in the past. In the New World, the war seemed like a foregone conclusion. The tanks were simply too strong for the Incan cities, and the rocket infantry shelled without mercy. It was violence, destruction, pain, and death. The air battle took place in the south, between Oslo and Tiwanaku, which had air power of its own, though nothing that could match the sheer brutality of Mongol power. It was almost a shame that it had taken the Incans so long to catch up technologically that it was now too late for them. They sent some brief attacks towards the New World, but they were outmatched, especially on the water, not only on the land. The march of progress continued, more progress as the Mongols saw it, and as the Mongols see it, as we know, progress is usually in terms of military conquest. Nazca falls in 2006, same year as the United Nations rise. But they don't stop there, of course. There's another city on the southern continent. There's an entire civilization to, well, he didn't want to say destroy, but assimilate, redirect in the New World. The bombers attacked Tiwanaku, naval power bombarded them, the tanks and the infantry, mechanized as we recall, attempted to take the city as swiftly as possible and negate any air power that the Incans were able to bring to bear. Now, these helicopters were a new technology untested at the time, and they were not as impressive as the tanks, but they were more maneuverable and undaunted by the need to travel over water or mountains. That gave them a bit of an advantage. Even so, despite their utility, they never saw widespread deployment, at least not during this conquest of the Incans. You can see the battles are proceeding well, at least from Genghis Khan's point of view. The cities are falling in swift succession 2007 saw a slew of cities being captured as Monka Temür marched down the east coast and Genghis Khan, Temujin himself, down the west coast. Here we see the fall of the last city on the southern continent, making it completely dominated once more by the Mongols. In desperation, Pachacuti had moved his capital to Cusco, a frontier town that was now nearly surrounded by the Mongols. Genghis Khan was a man who enjoyed symbolism, and naturally, he went right after the new capital. Bombers being stationed in Vienna so that they can carry out strikes against different parts of the Incan Empire. The air power was really a huge step forward in terms of the swiftness of warfare, if not its cleanliness. More civilian casualties mounted, despite the attempts of the Khans to direct the missiles and bombs in such a way that they would do the least amount of damage to civilian areas of the city. Not simply to spare civilian lives, but more so in order to leave them intact. Tiwanaku Falls, negating Inca's air advantage, and splitting up the remains of the Incan Empire between east and west coasts. Cusco comes under heavy siege. Tanks come in, workers captured and otherwise begin building swifter ways to get around the New World. And in the east, Monka Temür captures the last city, leaving only 3 Incan cities in the world. Now, with the capital under siege, it seemed that history was close to seeing the first total hegemony in existence. A hegemony, of course, being a governing body made up of a single power ruling multiple nations. And that was what the Mongol Empire was swift becoming. Having conquered everyone else in existence, it seemed only a matter of time before the Incans fell and the Mongols remained the only power in the world. Now you may be sitting there thinking, but that's horrific. The Mongols are destroying everything in their path. How can this be called humane? How can this be called progress? But don't think in terms of the world that you know. Think in terms of the world that we're witnessing here. One nation has proven itself superior to all others in every way. Who's to say that it's not in everyone's best interest that that nation take control of the world? With the capital fallen, it was only a matter of time before the Incans were completely under the heel of the Mongol hegemony. The world convulsed by war. Great and powerful civilizations have fallen, but one stood in the ashes of destruction. One raised itself up high. One declared, no, we will not be finished until we are finished. One civilization refused to accept half measures, and that civilization was, of course, the Mongol Empire. One more city remained in the New World, Machu, now the de facto capital of what was left of the Incan Empire. There was no way, as we know, that Genghis Khan would leave it at that. Temujin himself marched down to oversee the conquest of this major city. The rockets filled the sky, and the tanks marched into the city, conquering the last major bastion of Incan power in the world. Genghis Khan moved into Machu and retired from war. The people were ecstatic. Celebrations were in the streets everywhere. It seemed as if the long war was finally over, that the world could finally know peace under the benevolent rule of Chairman Temujin. That is, until in 2009, the hidden city of Atiko was discovered just off the coast of the New World. A simple island state sitting on its own. In 2010, the Pentagon was formed to deal with internal security. deal with insurrections and the like, of which there were few at the time, but history would change that, of course. Temujin was angry, but had delegated war entirely to Menka Temür. Menka Temür decided that there was only one way to ensure that the Incans completely surrendered, completely gave up, and completely realized that they had no chance to rebel against, fight against, stand against, or do anything against the Mongols. And that required extreme measures be taken against the island nation. Pachacuti had fled to Atiko at the conquest of Cusco, attempting to set up a government in exile which would be able to carry on the fight against the Mongols. Unfortunately, he was discovered before whatever plans he had could be brought to fruition, meaning that Menka Temür's final solution was quite effective indeed. Unfortunately, the ground troops moving in to take Atiko following the nuclear assault were damaged by the fallout, meaning that the war would be prolonged until more ground troops could be gotten to the tiny state. Nevertheless, the air attack continued against the last bastion of resistance in the known world. Menka Temür was merciless. He had long since proved his worth, long since proved that he lacked his father's weakness. But even so, this final conquest, this last step on the road to total domination, was to be Menka Temür's greatest triumph. Pachacuti sued for peace in 2012, but was, of course, refused. Here we see the ground troops finally storming the beaches of Atiko. Pachacuti captured. The Incan Empire destroyed, leaving only one power in the world. And that's why we all speak Mongolian today. So take a brief look at the capital, where it all began. A heavily built up city, surrounded by wonders. And here we see how the Mongol historical simulation stacks up against all the others. Looks pretty good. One player is in control of all capitals. No one bothered with the Apollo program. There weren't enough people for a diplomatic victory. And the Mongols started learning about culture far too late to win in that manner. As there is only one nation in the world, there is only one that is both the best and the worst in terms of demographics. Naturally, the Mongols. There are no other civilizations in the world, therefore there's nothing interesting to see here, except some issues from the past. Brief look at some of the information that we learned. The management of the vast empire, of course, took up the majority of the time, and that's something that we don't show in these videos, so that gave you a brief idea of how much civilization management was going on. And this is the Mongol army in all its glory. A massive, massive war machine that conquered the entire world. And we're done. So until we begin with the next civilization, all the best, and thank you for coming with me on this journey.